This podcast is a production of the Cable Podcast Network.
In the pines, where the sun never shines, you'll shiver when the cold wind blows. There's a grave in the pines, where the sun never shines. There's a grave that's shaded with the pines.
Of all the names associated with American history and with the western expansion of America over the Appalachian Mountains, Daniel Boone is the most famous name, or most famous frontiersman known to America. Daniel Boone was born a Quaker in Pennsylvania. Giving a little background information on him, his family came from Great Britain. They established themselves in Pennsylvania as Quakers as part of William Penn's colony. They were faithful Quakers. They were farmers. Daniel, as a young boy, his family bought a small acreage of land, 21 acres of grazing land for dairy cattle. And in the summer, his mother would take Daniel with him, and they would stay in kind of a small shelter or cabin in the woods and watch the cows while they grazed. That was Daniel's responsibility. It's been reported that he did a lot more running around and hunting than he did watching the cattle. But from this early childhood experience in the out of doors, in the woods, in a remote area, we see how Daniel Boone was carved into his love of hunting and nature. Daniel Boone's family moved to North Carolina. They had a history of moving, and so did Daniel Boone. When he was born in 1734 in Berks County, Pennsylvania, 70 of his 86 years, he explored the frontier. Even at the age of 31, he was looking for land in Pensacola, Florida. And when he died in 1820, he was living on the western boundary of civilization in St. Charles County, Missouri, one of the outposts for exploring the Rocky Mountains. Daniel Boone was hired by Richard Henderson, Judge Henderson, as part of the Transylvania Company, which Henderson owned. He bought him from the Cherokee for, it's reported, $10,000 in trinkets from the Cherokee, of course, who didn't really have a strong hold on Kentucky, but he bought the inner part of here, what we know as Kentucky today, and wanted to create a settlement. So he hired Boone to lead men into Kentucky, and Boone established this fort, which he named after himself, Boonesborough, on the Kentucky River, about 6 months to a year after Harrodsburg was founded. So it was the second settlement in Kentucky. Boone found this location he liked a lot, and one of the things that really excited him was when he first was there, he saw a salt lick on a small creek tributary of the Kentucky River, and there were buffalo wallowing in the salt lick. And he thought, what a great place to build a fort, because there'll be a regular supply of game near this salt lick. You know, establishing Boonesborough was a tough trick. This was the famous year of the sevens. It was to be a trying one for the people of Boonesborough. Times were not easy there. Manpower had dwindling to an insignificant number. Food was scarce. There was a continuous danger of Indian attacks and raids, and the Indian raids kept the settlers from attending their gardens and fields of crops. News came throughout the year that Indians were menacing up and down the Kentucky Valley. Bread and wheat and that type of thing was practically non-existent. The supply of gunpowder became exhausted, and in the dead of winter, salt gave out. So this leads us to the background information for the Siege of Boonesborough. So Boone takes 30 of his men from the fort and their salt-making equipment and heads for the lower Blue Licks on the Licking River to make salt. He takes his men up there, and Boone makes a deal with them that they do all the work making salt, and he'll provide him with meat because he's a great hunter. Yeah. He's an excellent shot. So he takes off, and he goes up, and he sees a buffalo and kills it. And, of course, when the shot rings out, if there's any Indians in the area, they hear it. And before he knew it, he was surrounded by Indians and captured by a band of Shawnee, of course, warriors. And this was really bad because they offered Boone a couple of choices. They said, you either surrender, you and your men, or we're going to surround you and kill all of you, including you.
Yeah.
So what's your choice?
Yeah. Well.
Yeah. Well, let's see. So Boone went back. He said, give me time to talk to my men.
Yeah.
The Indians took him back to the camp and surrounded it before they let Boone walk into his men. Mm-hmm. And he told his men, which were really kind of disgusted, that they were surrounded and they had no way of winning. There was something like 140 Indians, and there's only 20 or 30 of them.
Yeah.
So, to make a long story short, Boone talks them into surrendering, which they do, and the Shawnee Indians take them on a very tough march to Chillicothe, Ohio, to their main Indian village. At this point, and this is where the story begins to get interesting.
So today on our podcast, The Land Between the Meadows, we're focusing on Daniel Boone and the Siege of Boonesborough. We've talked before and prior about how Kentucky was basically not necessarily unoccupied, but basically used for hunting grounds for the Native Americans. And in our last episode, Early Explorers, we talked about how the Europeans, or the colonists, had nowhere else to go but west, and what lied west was Kentucky. And so, as Mr. Pope pointed out in the beginning introduction, Daniel Boone was hired here to start exploring Kentucky. And of course, we know from our previous episodes that the Native Americans, the Shawnee, the Chickasaw, the Iroquois, and the Cherokee used Kentucky primarily for hunting grounds. And now, though, with the impeding European settlers, or the colonists coming over, we're going to run into some trouble. And so now here we have Daniel Boone, who's been captured by the Shawnee, pretty much given one or two options: live or die. And his men are captured, and so now things will, as Mr. Pope said, are going to begin to get very interesting in the story of, say, Daniel Boone and Boonesborough.
A little backdrop information. While this was going on, the Revolutionary War had started in the East, and while the colonists were fighting for independence in the East, many people were flooding over the mountains into Kentucky. And of course, as we've talked to before, this made the Shawnees very angry. They were not happy with the settlers, the trappers, the hunters, the farmers that were coming in. The British took advantage of this situation, and they offered bounties for the settlers, scalps. Didn't matter if it was a man, woman, or child. Boone, which was an explorer and hunter, was surveying for the Transylvania Company, established this Boonesborough in 1775, as we were talking about. And as Native American attacks began to be more frequent, times began to be a lot tougher. At Blue Licks, these men are captured, as Mr. Cable stated, and were taken to Chillicothe, Ohio, where they were taken to the Governor Harrison in Detroit and sold. They offered for Boone 1,000 pounds sterling, and the Shawnee chief, Blackfish, had begun to like Boone because he was more like an Indian than he was a pioneer.
Let me interject here, Mr. Pope. What made Boone more like a Native American than a pioneer, and as far as the chief's eyes here?
Right. Okay. Well, of all the white men that Blackfish, who was the chief, had ever known, he had never found one he liked and respected as much as Daniel Boone. Here was a man who would have made a wonderful Indian, a man who excelled in whatever he did and never complained, a man who could be trusted to keep his word, and a man who understood the Indian. He was happy that Boone had consented to being adopted by him and became known as Sheltowee, or Big Turtle. So you've got Blackfish adopting Boone because he thinks so much of him. From The Frontiersman by Alan W. Eckert, there's an excerpt here that said, it had taken the captives 10 days of extremely uncomfortable travel in terrible weather to reach Chillicothe, and they remained there for a few weeks until March the 10th, when they were taken to Detroit. Okay? Boone's magnetic personality was an attraction to the Shawnees as his own countrymen, and they admired him greatly. After their return to Chillicothe, he put them off guard and became as friendly as possible with them, joining in their work and talk with a cheerfulness which bespoke an apparent happiness. He hunted with them frequently and gained added respect for his skill in shooting, both in game and in marksmanship at targets. He could easily outshoot any of them with a rifle, but he was careful to win the matches only once in a while, recognizing that they were extremely envious of his shooting ability and afraid their liking for him would turn into suspicion and distrust if he proved too good. In their stern and steady expressions, he thought he could detect great joy whenever they exceeded him in competition and great envy when the reverse was true. One thought was dominant in Daniel Boone's mind, though, through all of this, was that sooner or later he knew he would attempt his escape, and he must be successful, for there was no second chance. The penalty for white men recaptured, those who had been adopted before escaping, was a hideous death at the stake. Now, Boone's captivity with the Shawnee, he really enjoyed it. He married a woman.
Yeah.
And he was part of the chief's family. He frequently brought in the best cuts of meat for the chief and their family, so he was very revered as a hunter. They would only give him so much powder and shot, and they'd let him go out hunting, and he would put in half a load in his long rifle and save the powder and shot for the day when he did leave.
Yeah.
And he was having a high old time. He was there for 6 or 7 months living with the Indians, and he loved their way of life.
Yeah.
He was a hunter. As we've talked to before about the women who tilled the farms, Boone was a hunter. He liked being like an Indian and going out hunting every day and all that type of life.
So another question here. Do you think during this process of being captured and traveling to Detroit and being with the Native Americans, was he sincerely interested in being friends with them, or do you think it was a motive, if I befriend them, I'll have a chance to escape, or a mix?
I think it's a mix, but I think I think it's definite that he enjoyed being with them.
Yeah,
he was having a good old time, and he was having a good old time until he learned that there was a huge force of warriors that were going to attack Boonesborough.
Yeah.
And then things changed. And he was actually out with the Indians one day, salt making, because the Indians needed salt too.
Yeah.
And a party, and a flock of wild turkeys flew up, and the braves all went chasing after the wild turkeys. And Boone took out his knife and cut the kettles off the horse. And took off running as fast as he can on the horse to get away. It's interesting that he traveled for like 4 days and had one meal in 4 days. And all he had was a barrel of a rifle, the hammer mechanism on the flintlock rifle. And so on his way, he cut a part of a young tree and made a stock, which he cut the leather leggings off his horse and wrapped it around this piece of wood and made a long rifle, which he shot a buffalo with, and ate the buffalo, and that was his meal.
Yeah.
But when he was running, and then the horse gave out after 24 hours. It just keeled over, and he took off running on foot through the woods. And whenever he would find a fallen tree, he would run along the top of the tree on the ground in case he was being tracked, and then jump off.
So then,
he swam the Ohio River, of course, to get to the Kentucky River. By tying a bundle in front of him and pushing it across. And he arrived at the fort and told the settlers there of the impending danger that was coming.
So if it was a 4-day track here, from what point up north or in Ohio did he start from?
He started from Chillicothe.
All the way to basically Richmond nowadays.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's
so
right.
in a 4-day journey, that's quite a stake there. But I mean, if you have probably a assumable army of Native Americans coming down, you could probably make it.
There were some British, and there were actually some French soldiers mixed in with them. There were a force of nearly 450.
Yeah.
And Boonesborough had about 20 to 30 men.
Oh, wow.
Against 450. So the odds, you see, are very... And the fort was in really bad condition, and Boone immediately went to work strengthening the walls and trying to dig a well inside the fort, bringing water and food into the fort in preparation. So Blackfish arrives, and Blackfish is real friendly and wants Boone to come outside the fort and talk to him and said, "Why did you run away?" Well, he said, I missed my wife and children, and so I had to see my squaw. That's what he told Blackfish. Meanwhile, Rebecca Boone, Jemima, his daughter, had gotten married to a Callaway, and Rebecca and her other children had gone back to North Carolina because they thought Boone was dead.
Yeah. Well, and quick, how long was he with the Native Americans?
For about 8 months.
8 months, okay. All right.
He would have stayed longer. He wasn't any compelled to come back to Boonesborough, even though he loved the place and named it. He was making friends, and he was being treated well, and
But with the impending attack,
he decided his loyalties were with his family. There was something in there I read at one point about a story. I may not be real clear on it, but he had a cat that he was really fond of at the fort. And the cat had been missing all this time for 8 months. And, when he came back, they thought at first he was an Indian. They didn't even recognize him because his hair was like a mohawk and all this. But when he got in the fort, one of the ways they knew it was this cat came out of nowhere and jumped in his lap. And they said that cat wouldn't go to anyone but Boone.
So it's got to be him.
It's got to be him. So it's kind of funny. But they asked Boone to surrender the fort. Blackfish did, and Boone said, "Give me 2 days." So he went back in the fort and did it. And he came out, and they said, "Well, what is your decision?" And he said, "Well, I found out that while I was gone, they've got a new leader, and he's having a hard time deciding, so I need another 2 days." So they gave him 2 more days in friendship. And Boone said, "Help yourself to our cattle and our gardens, because I know your braves are hungry." They're both being like overly kind, but both knowing that, they're there to kill each other. And he stalled for time. The siege lasted for 9 to 10 days. This was September the 9th, 1778. They waged a battle of constant rifle shots. And one of the things they did several things that were just kind of miracles that Boonesborough didn't fall. They tied flaming arrows on with some gunpowder on the end of their arrows and shot them into the roof. And the arrows caught fire. They had a fuse on them, and the roofs were made out of like shake shingles. They only had 1 peg in them. And the women would run around with poles, and as the shingle caught on fire from the inside, they would jab up through the roof and knock the shingles off onto the ground. And Squire Boone, I believe, who was Daniel's brother, had made a type of squirt gun out of a log. And he had given that to the children, and they could shoot a quart of water at a time. And they went around squirting.
Putting out fires.
Putting out fires. So it was quite a scene. But the fort would have burned down, but it was also steady rain started coming. And that put the fire out. It was almost like, some people think it might be God's providence that it was saved.
So what was the final attack call? I mean, just...
Well, they tried many things, and among this was they decided to dig a tunnel. The Indians did, and they were going to put explosives under the fort and blow the wall up and then rush in. And the rain became so heavy and they could look out in the creek and see muddy water coming because they knew they were throwing their mud out into the water, and the tunnel collapsed. And there was this bravado that was going back and forth where the Indians were yelling insults to the and they were yelling just like sports, they were yelling it back, saying your mother, all this kind of stuff. And this went on the whole time. And one of the servants of the British colonel was a black slave named Pompeo. And he was the best shot of all the Indians and everyone. And he had picked off a person and was very accurate and known for his accuracy. Well, the legend has it that he climbed up in a tree some 60 or 80 yards off and was firing real accurately at the fort, wounding people. And Boone got his old tick licker out and leveled it and shot and killed him out of the tree.
Oh, wow.
And that was a big hurrah. Everyone in the African
momentum.
Slave was really, swinging momentum, had really been yelling a lot of insults and, showing his butt to him and all this stuff. And they were like mooning them back and all this kind of stuff was going on. It was crazy. But Boone killed him, shot him out of a tree.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was, Boone's marksmanship was known by everyone.
So back at the beginning when they were, give me 2 days, and this kind of stalemate at the point.
Yes.
What was the final attack call from the Shawnee and from Blackfish? We're not waiting no more.
Yeah. Well, they said, okay. They said, okay, come out. We're going to sign a peace treaty where there's not going to be any harm, but we want to be like gentlemen. Blackfish said, we want to shake hands.
Yeah.
Well, Boone brought out about 20 men, and he warned them. And he had people in the fort with guns trained out, in case something went wrong, about 30 or 40 yards from the fort. And they went out, and Boone noticed that the older Indians that were there had been replaced by younger, stronger braves. So they knew, and he had warned all of his men that there was a ruse. So as soon as they said, you have to shake double hands with the Indians. So they said, okay, let's all shake hands now. And they grabbed the settlers, both the Indians did, and tried to roll them down a bank out of the fire. But the settlers were onto it. And they knocked the Indians down, broke away, and ran as fast as they could for the fort. The fort opened up fire on the Indians. And only one man was wounded in the shoulder during all that. And that's when the hostilities continued unabated. There was a lot of circus stuff that went on because inside the fort, the women dressed up as men and marched back and forth to appear that there weren't just like 30 people in the fort against 450. The children put hats on sticks and went along the top of the wall, pushing them up and down like there were soldiers marching back and forth. So everyone was employed to try to scare the Indians and pretend like there was a lot more than what there really were. So anyway, going back to the tunnel, the tunnel collapsed in all the heavy rain that came about, and that really discouraged the Indians. And the rain and the downpour, it was just like, come on, and the fires being put out by, the rain. Discouraged the Indians. They thought it was a bad sign. And when the slave was shot and killed, that was also a bad sign.
There was their MVP at the moment.
That was their
losing
MVP.
him. They
lost their MVP. That's right. There were something like Boonesborough had 2 men killed and 4 wounded at the end of the siege. That was all. And the Indians lost 37 killed and, of course, a great number wounded. The Indians would carry all their wounded and dead away, so you wouldn't be able to actually have a battlefield count. Because it was just cleared after they left. But by all accurate accounts, there were 37 Indians killed and a great number wounded. Of course, running across an open field.
To a fort.
But at the end of the siege, it's important to note that the settlers at Boonesborough wouldn't have lasted another day. They were out of powder. They were digging lead out of the fort walls to remelt and make bullets. They were out of gunpowder practically. They had rationed it, and they were just physically exhausted from the night-and-day siege. So they left. If the Indians would have just attacked the fort in mass, they would have taken it. But that wasn't their tactics. They didn't like that.
They didn't like the signs, the way things were going. And do you think, too, that maybe, and this is us just, I guess, being theoretical or just thinking on our own here, that Blackfish might have, just, wanted to leave it be, and maybe there was that kinship with Boone, and, things aren't looking good, let's just go and not necessarily.
I think so. I think so. I think the 10 British and French officers that were there, I think they wanted to stay and lay siege. But I think the Indians were really discouraged. They thought it was a sign from their God that things were not meant to be. And they were real believers in that. If things didn't go right at first, they just, screw it,
Let's regroup.
Let's regroup and let's have a day when things are going our way. This ain't happening. They'd spent 9 or 10 days there, and it was frustrating. So they crossed back over the Ohio and went back home.
Let it be for the time.
And the ragged, tagged people of Boonesborough somehow survived against odds. 450, 445 against maybe 30.
The whole story. That's it's like a movie.
It would make a great movie.
We can produce it now.
That's right. Send us $100,000 and we'll go out in the woods. We'll go in the woods and shoot up in the air. Send you a great video.
To think you have this character, Daniel Boone, gets captured, is brought into the culture, accepted, and is good with staying. But then finds out they're going to attack his home, and he probably at the time thought my kids, my wife and kids they're all going to die. So go back to there, and then this massive battle occurs where basically you get out by luck. There's no other way to really describe it.
It's crazy. And, it was some hard times there. The men that were captured at Boonesborough, we don't talk much about them, that were taken to Detroit. They were really bitter because, here they're being held in bondage and beaten and treated bad. And Boone's like going out on hunting trips and living it up. Had squaws and hadn't got a wife, and it was this chief's adopted son.
Yeah.
It's like, hey, man, did you forget us?
Yeah.
So after it's over, this is important.
Okay.
They charged Boone with treason.
Yeah.
They arrested him. And they took him to Fort Logan.
Who,
Daniel Boone?
Settlement?
The settlement did. They
wow.
did. And they took him to Fort Logan on trial.
Yeah.
The trial of Daniel Boone. And they charged him with treason.
Yeah. Wow.
A traitor.
That is insane.
Yeah, he is. Yeah. And he was not guilty.
Yeah.
After about a 3-day trial.
But what about
They were a little sore over him, though.
So real quickly though, another thought. What happened to the men that were captured?
I'm not sure what happened to them. I don't know if they were released as British
executed
prisoners. I don't think they were.
Yeah.
There was another man that escaped and came back to the fort. And he was a little sore, too. It took him 8 days, where it took Boone 4 days to get back.
Yeah.
But he was
a little sore.
He was a little sore, Boone, when he got back there, too.
You didn't think about coming out and helping the rest of them?
Their families, they go out to get salt. They don't ever come back. And Boone comes back all joyous and looking like an Indian. Think about it.
Yeah. Well, and
telling everybody what to do.
Another question I have, because at the beginning you said, Daniel Boone, the hero Daniel Boone, he's kind of a legend in our time.
Very much so.
Now, and this is just me thinking, or this is just a question, and it may vary. And I have my opinion, but okay. So you have
That's
Daniel.
That's the way history is. You do have opinions.
Yeah. If you look at Daniel Boone, so he did all this exploring, great stuff for Kentucky and settlements and the colonists, all that good stuff. But does his betrayal in the sorts of Blackfish, like going against, you adopted me, you gave me all, you didn't kill me, you were a man of your word, and then he betrays Blackfish in a sense, does that paint him in a negative light, or is the other stuff just so good we can't even address?
Well, I think it's funny. I think it's all humorous myself. But I think that's really a good question, and it's one of opinion. But I think he told Blackfish a really logical excuse. He said he wanted to get back to his squaw and his children, and that he was going to bring them back to the village, is what he said.
Yeah.
He was really lying through his teeth.
Oh, yeah.
And I think Blackfish at a certain time, saying, well, let's sign a document and all be friends, and he was lying through his teeth.
Too,
So, they're all a bunch of liars.
Yeah.
But the thing about Boone was, he proved, and that came out at his trial, that all these things he did, like surrendering the salt maker, he really did save their lives.
Yeah. And
all this stuff, it wouldn't have done anybody any good if he would have just been sour grapes with the Indians. It allowed him to be free and go back and warn Boonesborough of the attack.
Yeah.
So he really was a hero, even though at times to the men that were strangled and beaten, he didn't, and he's going, da 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 da,
I'm going to hunt, boys. Keep your hands up.
That's what he did. That's exactly what for 8 months.
But in true,
hanging out with the squaws,
and when you look at it,
eating buffalo tongue.
to say he was being friendly with them and warming up to them, it all makes sense. This was a big plan.
It really was.
I'm going to warm up to him. I'm going to be with, even though I like all this stuff too. But when I get my chance, I'm going.
I think historians would, some historians might argue with you about that, because if he hadn't have learned that there were 450 of the bravest, meanest warriors that were heading towards Boonesborough, he would have just kept doing this gig.
Oh, yeah.
He was happy.
He wasn't
going to go back to Boonesborough. I don't think.
Don't think so?
I don't think so. I don't think he was. I think it was just a dawn on him, like he had to make a decision.
Yeah.
And he decided to go back for his own fort named after him, try to save it.
I guess I should protect the city or the fort established.
I think it was a very sobering experience for him to do that. And he told his grandmother, Indian, adopted mother, who was at the salt camp, that he was going to bring his wife and children back for her to meet. And that's when he cut the salt thing. She was there when he got jumped on the horse while the other Indians were off trying to shoot turkeys.
Wow.
And he said, I'll be back, honey, and I'll bring my wife and children because we want to live with you because things are so good here.
Yeah.
And that's a little bit of an insight, too.
Yeah, and it's all well, it's history, so it's all just
But
up
he
for...
took off in the wilderness with 400 warriors chasing him, and all he had was the barrel of a rifle and the lock plate that fit inside it.
Yeah.
And some saved up in a pouch, powder and a couple of bullets, and cut a limb off a tree and made a long rifle and shot a buffalo.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's amazing.
That's amazing. And he's an amazing guy.
Yeah.
And then ran and swam the Ohio River and got back. And it's a pretty amazing tale. But the consequences, for American history and the American Revolution and everything else, it would if they would have taken Boonesborough, it could have been all over for them.
And I mean, you think if they're the French soldiers that were there, like we talked about before, the French were big buddies with the Native Americans. You had the
they
British.
tried to exploit that feeling of the Shawnees invading, so they got the Shawnees to be their allies to scalp all these people here around Crab Orchard and everywhere else.
And then you got the British, who are literally in war right now with the Americans or the colonists.
So they were smart to use the Indian allies.
Yeah.
And, the worst battle of the whole Revolutionary War, at least the last one, the Battle of Blue Licks, was where the British advisors and the Shawnees killed Daniel Boone's son, another one of his son, and all these Kentucky frontiersmen that were slaughtered up there in an ambush. That was all British plan. They gave them the guns.
Yeah, right. Well, that should wrap up our discussion about Daniel Boone and the Siege of Boonesborough. I know, as far as my background goes, I would not have heard or known of this story unless I knew Mr. Pope, and there's just so much more to the exploration and the things around here in Kentucky that you probably don't know or realize.
I wouldn't have known this story unless I had the opportunity to make it up.
So that we'll conclude with Boonesborough and
if you have any
Boone.
other questions or comments or tell us some things, we're glad to hear from you.
Yeah, we now have a Facebook page. If you want to join the Cable Podcast Network group, you can join that, and we'll post our episodes on there, and you can comment and we'll discuss with us, real quickly, since Facebook is everywhere.
We don't have any squaws for you. We can answer a few questions.
And two, a little real quick before we go, what lies next?
We look at another Kentucky hero, Simon Kenton, who probably in the traditional classroom doesn't get as much attention as Boone, but was equally as important.
Yeah. So a little bit of mystery there with Simon Kenton. We'll get more into that next time. And again, if you have any questions, you can send me a message on Twitter at CableDad5 or on Facebook. And again,
Simon Kenton saved Daniel Boone's life.
So there you go.
We'll talk about that.
I mean, there's Mr. Pope has briefed me a little bit on Simon Kenton, and there is much more to that than you think. Everybody knows of Daniel Boone, but you do not know of Simon Kenton, the frontiersman, right?
That's right.
So we'll get into more of that later. And again, just let us know. Comment if you have anything to add.
Just hang in there and keep your head low.
As Daniel Boone would have said. Right?
Yes, that's right.
All right. See you. If you would like to join the conversation and give your thoughts on this podcast and other episodes, join the Cable Podcast Network group on Facebook. If you're enjoying the content of this podcast and would like to support it, visit anchor.fm/The Meadows Kentucky History/support. You can also find this link in the show's description. If you want to help our podcast grow in other ways, like the Cable Podcast Network page on Facebook and share our links on all social media outlets. If you're listening to this podcast on iTunes, give us a positive review and leave a comment. Thanks for all your support.